Story 1. The Cursed Forest of Aokigahara. Aokigahara, a forest so densely packed with trees that even the sunlight struggles to penetrate its depths, lies at the base of Mount Fuji. It is a place that evokes both awe and dread. For centuries it has been known for its beauty and silence, but in recent decades the forest has gained an infamous reputation. Locals call it Jukai, the Sea of Trees, but the rest of the world knows it by another, far darker name, the Suicide Forest. What many don't realize is that this forest holds much more than the weight of lost souls. It is said to be a place where the boundary between the living and the dead is thin, a place haunted by entities far older and darker than any human tragedy. The stories of eerie happenings in Aokigahara are numerous, but there is one tale that has been passed down through generations, one that strikes fear into the hearts of those who dare to enter after nightfall. It all began with a group of friends, 3 men and 2 women, who, like so many others, were drawn to the forest out of morbid curiosity. They had heard the stories of suicides, of the haunted trails and unsettling energies, but they were young and reckless, convinced that these tales were exaggerated. Ghosts were nothing more than folklore, they thought. So they made a plan to hike deep into Aokigahara at night, determined to experience the infamous forest for themselves. As they entered the forest just before dusk, the towering trees loomed over them like ancient sentinels, their thick branches forming a canopy so dense it felt like the night had already begun. The deeper they ventured, the more they noticed the stillness. No birds, no insects, not even the rustling of leaves in the wind, just an oppressive, suffocating silence that seemed to grow heavier with every step. Their laughter and casual conversation echoed unnaturally, swallowed almost immediately by the forest, as though the trees were listening. The trail became less defined as they moved further in. Despite the forest's beauty in the daylight, under the weight of approaching nightfall, it felt otherworldly. The air itself seemed to thicken, and with it came a creeping sense of unease. When darkness finally fell, the forest seemed to come alive, but not in a way they could have ever anticipated. The trees, once just imposing, now appeared twisted and malformed in the dim light of their flashlights. The underbrush rustled with unseen movement, though no animals could be seen. Every now and then one of them would stop, turning suddenly as if feeling a gaze upon them, only to find nothing but shadows. And then it began. At first it was barely perceptible, a soft murmur on the wind like the forest itself was breathing. It wasn't until one of the women, Yumi, froze in place, her face pale, that the others truly noticed. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The group stopped, straining to listen, and that's when they heard it too. A whisper. Low, guttural, almost indistinguishable, but unmistakably a voice. "Keep moving," one of the men, Hiroshi, said, his voice edged with forced confidence. "It's just the wind." But as they continued down the darkened path, the whispers grew louder. They were no longer soft murmurs, but a cacophony of overlapping voices, some crying, some laughing, others murmuring unintelligible words. Each step felt heavier, as if the very ground beneath them was pulling them down, urging them to stay. Soon, the laughter started. Faint at first, a single chuckle somewhere behind them, then more, a chorus of eerie, high-pitched giggles that echoed through the trees. The group stopped dead in their tracks, panic setting in. "Who's there?" One of them shouted into the darkness, but only the laughter answered. "Let's go back. Now," Yumi pleaded, her voice tight with fear. But when they turned to retrace their steps, the path they had come from seemed to shift. The trail, once clearly visible, was gone, swallowed by the forest as if it had never existed. Now lost, the group began to argue, fear turning to desperation. Their flashlights flickered as though the batteries were dying, casting long shadows that danced mockingly around them. But it wasn't just their own shadows. Pale, ghostly figures began to appear in the distance, barely visible through the mist that had settled over the forest floor. At first they thought it was their eyes playing tricks on them, shapes in the mist, wavering with the light. But soon it became clear that something was out there. The figures moved with unsettling slowness, gliding between the trees, their forms indistinct yet undeniably human-like. One by one the friends spotted them, and with each sighting, their panic grew. "We have to get out of here!" Akira, the tallest of the group, shouted, grabbing Yumi's hand and pulling her forward. But as they ran, the forest seemed to twist and turn around them, leading them deeper into its heart rather than out. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and with them came an overwhelming feeling of dread. Yumi could barely breathe, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel something behind her, something cold and heavy. She didn't dare look back, but she could sense it, following them, watching them, waiting. Suddenly, Yumi screamed, a piercing sound that shattered the night. She had fallen to the ground, clutching her ankle, but that wasn't why she screamed. As the others rushed to her side, she pointed ahead with a trembling hand. There, not more than a few feet away, stood a figure, tall, gaunt, and deathly still. Its face was a blur like smoke or mist, but its eyes, those hollow black eyes, were locked on Yumi, staring into her as if seeing every secret, every fear she had ever known. The others saw it too. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was overwhelming, cold, unnatural, and filled with an ancient malice. As they backed away, they realized it wasn't alone. Dozens of figures began to emerge from the shadows, their forms flickering in and out of view, their movements jerky and unnatural. They surrounded the group, their whispers now loud and clear, accusations, cries for help, voices pleading for release. "We need to leave now," Hiroshi shouted, dragging Yumi to her feet. But it was as if the forest itself was working against them. No matter which direction they ran, the figures followed, always just out of reach, always watching. And then, the laughter returned, louder and more maniacal than before. It was then that they realized the truth. These were not just the lost souls of the dead. They were something far older, far darker. Spirits bound to the forest, drawn by the despair of those who entered, feeding off their fear, their hopelessness. When they finally stumbled out of the forest hours later, the sun had begun to rise, casting long shadows across the forest floor. But the experience had changed them. Yumi, who had been the most affected, never spoke of that night again, but she wasn't the same. She complained of strange dreams, of shadows in her room at night, of whispers that followed her wherever she went. Some say that once you enter Aokigahara, you never truly leave, that a part of you remains behind, claimed by the spirits who dwell there. Aokigahara is more than just a place of tragedy. It is a place of horror, where the boundaries between the living and the dead blur, and those who enter may find themselves forever haunted. For in the sea of trees, it is not just the lost souls who wander, but something much darker, much older, that waits in the shadows, watching, whispering, waiting for its next victim. Story 2. The Cursed Forest of Hoia Baciu, Romania. Deep in the heart of Transylvania lies Hoia Baciu Forest, a place that has earned the chilling title of the Bermuda Triangle of Transylvania. For centuries, the forest has been a subject of fear and fascination, drawing adventurers, scientists, and paranormal investigators alike. By day, it may appear like any other woodland, a dense forest with twisted trees and a carpet of soft moss. But when night falls, Hoia Baciu reveals its true, sinister nature. The stories surrounding Hoia Baciu are not mere folklore. Over the years, hundreds of people have reported strange and terrifying occurrences after stepping into the forest. From eerie lights that float among the trees to shadowy figures that seem to watch from the darkness, the forest has a way of luring people deeper into its cursed heart, and some who enter never return. One of the most unsettling tales involves a group of 5 friends, students from nearby Cluj-Napoca, who decided to camp in Hoia Baciu, hoping to experience the paranormal firsthand. They had heard the rumors of ghost sightings, UFOs, and mysterious disappearances. But like many before them, they believed it was all just a collection of tall tales. Eager for a thrill, they packed their gear and set off on what they thought would be a harmless weekend adventure. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew heavy, and an unnatural silence fell over the group. Not a single bird sang, and the familiar rustling of leaves in the breeze was absent. It was as if the forest itself had been holding its breath, waiting. The friends set up camp in a clearing, an area known as the Circle of Death, where vegetation refused to grow and no animals ever ventured. The clearing was eerily symmetrical, and despite the surrounding forest being dense, no trees grew within this circle. The ground, though covered in dry soil, felt oddly spongy underfoot. As night descended, The forest became alive with inexplicable noises. Faint whispers carried on the wind, disembodied footsteps crunching leaves just out of sight, and distant, high-pitched screeches that made the hair on the back of their necks stand on end. As they sat around their campfire trying to laugh off their unease, one of them, a girl named Elena, noticed a strange light flickering among the trees. It was not the flicker of a fire or the beam of a flashlight. This light was greenish in hue, pulsating softly, like something organic and alive. Before she could say anything, the light moved, darting between the trees faster than any human could. The others noticed it too, their conversations falling silent as they all stared, mesmerized and horrified by the glowing apparition. "What is that?" whispered Andre, the most skeptical of the group. He stood up, his eyes fixed on the light, his breath shallow. The forest felt as though it was closing in on them, the trees leaning forward, their branches twisting like fingers reaching for the group. Suddenly, without warning, the light vanished. In its place was silence, an overwhelming, suffocating silence. For a moment, none of them moved, their eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. And then, the voices began. Faint at first, the whispers seemed to come from all directions. They were unintelligible, like many people speaking at once, but in a language none of them could understand. Elena clutched her arms, feeling the air around her grow colder, and her body stiffened in fear. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. Suddenly, one of the friends, a boy named Mihai, stood up abruptly and began walking toward the edge of the clearing. "Mihai! Where are you going?" Elena cried, her voice shaking. But Mihai didn't respond. His movements were stiff, mechanical, as though something had taken control of his body. He walked in a straight line toward the dense trees, his eyes blank, his face devoid of expression. The others called out to him, panic rising in their voices, but it was as if Mihai couldn't hear them. His footsteps grew quicker, more determined, until he disappeared into the shadows of the forest, swallowed by the darkness. Panic set in. Andre and the others rushed after him, their flashlights flickering as they plunged into the trees. But no matter how fast they ran, Mihai was always just out of reach. His figure, now barely visible through the thick trees, moved deeper and deeper into the forest, as though something was pulling him toward an unseen destination. After what felt like an eternity, the forest began to change around them. The trees grew twisted, their branches gnarled and blackened. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic like blood. Elena suddenly felt a sharp, cold sensation run down her spine, as if invisible hands were touching her. The whispers had grown louder now, more insistent, as if they were calling for her. Then, without warning, Mihai stopped. He stood motionless in a small, moonlit clearing, his back to the group. The others skidded to a halt, their breaths ragged and shallow. Mihai's figure was still, too still. Something wasn't right. "Mihai?" Andre called out, his voice trembling, but Mihai didn't respond. Slowly, cautiously, they approached him. But as they drew closer, they realized in horror that the figure standing in the clearing was not Mihai at all. It was something else. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, black, hollow pits, stared blankly ahead. The figure wore clothes that resembled Mihai's, but its face was grotesquely distorted, like a reflection in a shattered mirror. And then it smiled. A cold, inhuman grin spread across its face, revealing teeth that were far too sharp, far too long. The figure let out a guttural, rasping laugh that echoed through the forest, sending a chill down their spines. And then, in a blink, it was gone, vanishing into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. The group, now terrified beyond reason, ran. They didn't care which direction, they just needed to get out. But the forest was no longer the same. The path they had come from was gone, replaced by a labyrinth of trees that seemed to move and shift as they ran. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, and with each step the cold paralysis began to creep over them. One by one they began to feel it, the numbness in their limbs, the strange sensation of being held in place by invisible hands. Elena was the first to collapse, her legs giving out beneath her as she fell to the forest floor. She tried to scream, but no sound came. Her body was frozen, her mind racing in terror as the shadows around her began to move, swirling and dancing in the corners of her vision. By the time the first rays of dawn broke over the forest, only two of the friends made it out, Andre and Elena, though neither of them could remember how. Mihai, along with the others, was never seen again. Search parties combed the forest for weeks, but no trace of them was ever found. It was as if they had simply vanished, swallowed whole by Hoya Baciu's cursed heart. To this day, locals warn against entering Baciu at night. They speak of the forest's hunger, of the strange lights and voices that lure the unsuspecting to their doom. Those who enter often come back changed, if they come back at all. Because in the Bermuda Triangle of Transylvania, the forest itself is alive, and it does not let its prey go easily. Story 3, The Haunting of Witchwood Forest, England. Deep within the English countryside lies Witchwood Forest, a place where ancient trees twist together to form a canopy so dense that sunlight struggles to penetrate even on the brightest of days. But as night falls, the forest transforms into a realm of eerie shadows and unsettling silence, a place where whispers from the past linger in the cold, still air. Locals say Witchwood is cursed, a place where the living dare not tread after dark, for fear of what or who they may encounter. Witchwood's most infamous tale is that of Amy Robsart, the ill-fated wife of Robert Dudley, a close confidant of Queen Elizabeth I. Amy died under mysterious circumstances in 1560, found dead at the bottom of a staircase. Some say it was an accident, others whisper of murder, but one thing is certain: her spirit has never found peace. For centuries, there have been sightings of her ghost wandering the forest, her cries of sorrow carried on the wind, a desperate plea for help that chills those who hear it to their very bones. It was a cold autumn evening when Charlotte and her fiancé, Thomas, decided to take a moonlit walk through Witchwood Forest. They had been visiting family in the nearby village, and being avid hikers, couldn't resist the allure of the ancient woods despite the warnings from the locals. "It's just an old legend," Thomas had said, brushing off the concerned words of the innkeeper. "Ghosts don't exist." But as they entered the forest, Charlotte couldn't shake a feeling of unease. The trees loomed tall and menacing, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal hands against the night sky. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though the forest itself was watching them. Every step they took seemed to echo louder than it should, the crunch of leaves beneath their feet unnervingly sharp in the otherwise quiet night. "I don't like this," Charlotte whispered, clutching Thomas's arm tightly. He chuckled softly, trying to calm her nerves, but even he felt it. A strange sensation in the air, like a presence lingering just out of sight. They had walked for about half an hour when they came upon a clearing. In the center stood an ancient oak, its twisted trunk scarred with age. The clearing was unnaturally silent, not even the usual rustling of leaves could be heard. But then faintly there was something else, a sound that sent a shiver down Charlotte's spine, a soft sobbing. It was distant at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with each passing moment. Charlotte froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas nodded, his face pale. The sobbing grew closer, echoing through the trees, surrounding them. And then, from the shadows at the edge of the clearing, she appeared. A figure dressed in white, her long, flowing gown trailing along the ground as she walked slowly toward them. Her face was obscured by the darkness, but the sadness emanating from her was palpable. Her shoulders shook as she wept, and her arms reached out as though begging for help. "It's her," Charlotte whispered, barely able to speak. "Amy Robsart." The ghostly figure moved closer, her sobbing turning into desperate wails of agony. "Help me, please, help me." Her voice was fragile, filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to resonate with the very earth beneath them. Charlotte wanted to run, to scream, but her legs refused to move. She was rooted to the spot, her heart pounding in her chest as the ghost came closer and closer. And then, as suddenly as she had appeared, Amy's sobbing ceased. The figure stopped just a few feet away, her pale face now visible in the dim moonlight. Her eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to swallow the light around them, and her mouth hung open in a silent scream. "Those who see her are cursed," Charlotte remembered the innkeeper's warning. "They are doomed to suffer loss or death." A sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it a chorus of soft sighs, as though the very spirits of the forest were breathing around them. The branches of the oak above them creaked and groaned, and the temperature dropped rapidly, the warmth of their breath turning into visible puffs in the freezing air. "Thomas, we have to leave," Charlotte said, her voice shaking as she tugged at his arm. But Thomas remained still, his gaze fixed on the ghostly figure before them. And then, without warning, Amy Robsart's ghost let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the forest, sending birds scattering from the trees in a frenzy. Her outstretched hands, once begging for help, now clawed at the air as if reaching for Charlotte and Thomas, her face contorted in a mask of pure agony. Thomas finally snapped out of his trance, grabbing Charlotte's hand as they bolted back toward the path. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees bending and twisting as they ran. The sobbing continued to follow them, growing fainter and fainter until it was swallowed by the thick, suffocating silence of Witchwood Forest. They didn't stop running until they had reached the edge of the woods, panting and drenched in cold sweat. As they looked back, the forest appeared still and quiet, as though nothing had happened. But they knew better. The curse of Amy Robsart was not just an old wives' tale. Less than a week after their encounter, tragedy struck. Charlotte's younger brother, only 16, was killed in a car accident on a desolate country road. The loss devastated her family, and as they mourned, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that the ghostly figure in the woods had been responsible. In the years that followed, Thomas's family too would experience inexplicable losses. Deaths that seemed random, but eerily coincidental. They tried to forget that night, to bury it in the past, but the curse of Witchwood lingered, always in the back of their minds, a reminder of the forest's dark and unforgiving power. To this day, those who wander into Witchwood Forest at night are warned. If you hear the cries of Amy Robsart, if you see her pale figure moving through the trees, turn back immediately. For once you've seen her, it's already too late. The forest does not forget, and neither do its restless spirits. Story 4, The Dark Secrets of the Black Forest. Deep in the heart of Germany lies the Black Forest, a place as ancient as the land itself, cloaked in myths and shrouded in shadows. By day, it is a sprawling expanse of dense trees and rugged terrain, bathed in sunlight and serene to the eye. But at night, the forest transforms into something altogether more sinister. The tall, thick trees form an impenetrable wall of darkness, and the silence becomes suffocating, broken only by the occasional sound of unseen things moving in the underbrush. The villagers living near the forest's edge often spoke of it in hushed tones. They warned outsiders not to venture inside after dark, for the forest was not just home to animals but to something far more malevolent. The stories were as old as the trees themselves, of wandering spirits, strange creatures, and of people who entered the Black Forest at night and never returned. It was a warm summer evening when 4 friends, Emily, Tobias, Anna, and Eric, decided to camp in the Black Forest. They were city dwellers, adventurous and young, and had little regard for the old legends. The idea of spending a night in the infamous forest thrilled them. Tobias, the most daring of the group, laughed off the warnings from the locals as nothing more than superstitious nonsense. "We'll be fine," he said confidently. "What's the worst that could happen? It's just a forest." Armed with flashlights and supplies, they made their way deep into the forest, the thick canopy above them quickly swallowing the last rays of daylight. The deeper they ventured, the more isolated they felt. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches gnarled and twisted like the hands of forgotten souls reaching out from the darkness. As night fell, the forest came alive with eerie sounds, rustling leaves, the creaking of trees, and the distant, unidentifiable noises that seemed to echo from deep within. The temperature dropped sharply, and the once warm air became damp and cold. Despite the fire they had built, an unnatural chill hung in the air, sending shivers down their spines. Anna was the first to feel it, the unsettling sensation of being watched. She said nothing at first, dismissing it as her imagination, but the feeling only grew stronger with each passing hour. The others, too, began to sense it. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching their every move, waiting. As they sat around the fire, trying to shake off their unease, a strange sound broke through the silence. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the crackling of the flames, but it grew louder, an odd, rhythmic rustling, like something or someone moving through the trees just beyond the reach of the firelight. "Do you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. The others nodded, their faces pale in the flickering light. Tobias, always the skeptic, grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and underbrush. "It's probably just an animal," he muttered, though there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice. But then they heard it again, closer this time. It wasn't just rustling. There were footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling them just out of sight. The four of them exchanged nervous glances. Eric stood up, scanning the perimeter of their camp, but saw nothing. Suddenly the wind picked up, and with it came a low, mournful sound. It wasn't the wind, though. It was something else, something far more unsettling. It was a whisper, faint and unintelligible, as though the forest itself was trying to communicate with them. Emily gasped, clutching at Tobias's arm. "Let's go back," she urged, her voice barely above a whisper. "We shouldn't be here." But Tobias shook his head, unwilling to admit defeat. "It's just the wind," he insisted, though the fear in his eyes betrayed him. As the hours crept by, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The fire, once bright and warm, now seemed feeble against the encroaching darkness. Shadows danced in the trees, twisting and shifting in unnatural ways. Emily kept glancing over her shoulder, convinced she had seen something moving in the distance, a dark figure, tall and thin, slipping between the trees. But every time she turned her flashlight in that direction, it vanished. "I saw something," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There's someone out there." Anna's face went pale. "I've seen it too," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Tobias stood up, his frustration finally boiling over. "Enough. It's just the forest playing tricks on us. There's no one out there." But as soon as he spoke, the fire flickered violently, and then, with a sudden gust of wind, it went out. The four of them were plunged into complete darkness, their only light now coming from their flashlights, which seemed pathetically weak against the overwhelming blackness of the forest. And then they heard it, the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing, followed by the slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps in the leaves. "It's getting closer," Eric whispered, his voice barely controlled. They huddled together, their flashlights frantically scanning the darkness, but they saw nothing. The breathing grew louder, more labored, as if something was stalking them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Suddenly, Emily screamed. She had felt something brush against her leg, something cold and clammy, like the hand of a corpse. The others shone their flashlights toward her, but there was nothing there. "We need to leave, now," Anna cried, her voice cracking with fear. But it was too late. The forest had claimed them. In their panic, they scrambled to gather their things and run, but the forest seemed to work against them. The paths they had taken earlier were gone, swallowed by the trees. The more they ran, the more lost they became. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to move on their own, closing in around them like predators stalking their prey. Tobias, leading the group, suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice shaking. Ahead of them, barely visible in the gloom, was a figure, a tall, shadowy silhouette standing perfectly still in the middle of the path. It was humanoid in shape, but its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head too small, and its movements, when it finally began to move, were slow and jerky, like a puppet on strings. They turned to run in the opposite direction, but the figure was there too, now closer, now clearer. Its eyes, or what should have been its eyes, were hollow, black voids that seemed to suck the light from the flashlights. They were trapped. Days later, a search party was sent into the Black Forest to find them. Their campsite was discovered, abandoned and eerily quiet. The fire had long since burned out, their belongings scattered as if they had fled in a hurry. But of the four friends, there was no sign. Months passed, and their disappearances became another grim chapter in the long, dark history of the Black Forest. The villagers, when asked about them, simply shook their heads. The forest doesn't like to let go of those it claims, they would say. Some believe the four friends are still out there, wandering the endless, shadowy paths of the Black Forest, lost in a world where the boundaries between the living and the dead have blurred. Others say they were taken by the spirits that haunt the woods, or perhaps by something far older and far darker. To this day, the Black Forest remains a place of dread, where the darkness seems deeper, the air colder, and the whispers never stop. For those who dare to enter, the warning is always the same. Once you set foot in the Black Forest, you may never come out again. Story 5, The Devil's Tramping Ground. Where nightmares dance deep, in the woods of North Carolina, lies a place shrouded in mystery and fear. An unassuming patch of land known as the Devil's Tramping Ground. It's a barren, circular area in the forest, about 40 feet wide, where nothing grows. No plant, no tree, not even a single blade of grass has ever been able to take root there. The locals call it cursed. The animals, they say, avoid it altogether, as if some unseen force keeps them away. And those who have dared to enter the circle after dark have come back with tales of terror, if they come back at all. The stories surrounding the Devil's Tramping Ground have been passed down for generations, each more chilling than the last. According to legend, this desolate patch of earth is where Satan himself comes to dance in the dead of night. It's said that every evening, the devil rises from the underworld and paces around the circle, plotting his next move against humanity. By morning, any object left inside the circle has been violently displaced, as though something or someone had pushed it aside. And those who sleep there, they say, wake up miles away, haunted by nightmares so vivid and horrifying that they can't escape them even in the daylight. Years ago, a group of college students, Matt, Julia, Chris, and Danielle, decided to test the legend. They were adventurous, skeptical, and bored of ordinary weekend plans. Camping out at the Devil's Tramping Ground seemed like the perfect way to scare themselves silly and prove the old legends wrong. "This is ridiculous," Matt laughed as they approached the circle. "It's just a patch of dirt. People love to scare themselves with stories." The air felt heavy as they neared the spot, the towering trees surrounding the clearing like silent sentinels. The circle itself was unnerving, even in the fading daylight. It was as if the life had been sucked out of the land, leaving a perfect ring of dead earth. The atmosphere shifted as soon as they stepped inside, a prickling sensation creeping up their spines. They set up camp just outside the circle, careful not to cross the invisible line. As night fell, the forest became eerily quiet. Even the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves seemed to vanish, replaced by an oppressive silence. The fire crackled, casting long shadows across the campsite, but nothing could shake the feeling that they were being watched. As midnight approached, the temperature dropped sharply. A cold wind began to stir the leaves, though the trees above them were still. Julia shivered, pulling her jacket tighter. "This place is giving me the creeps," she whispered, glancing nervously at the circle. Chris, always the jokester, picked up a stick and tossed it into the center of the ring. "Let's see if the devil really wants to dance tonight," he said with a smirk. But as soon as the stick hit the ground, it rolled unnaturally fast to the edge of the circle, as though something had pushed it back out. The group exchanged uneasy glances. "That was weird," Danielle muttered, but she tried to laugh it off. "It's probably just the slope." But then the footsteps started. At first, they were faint, barely noticeable over the crackling fire. But soon they became louder, heavy, deliberate, and unmistakable. Footsteps circled them in the dark, just beyond the light of the fire. Julia's face went pale. "Who's out there?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, just the relentless sound of pacing footsteps, round and round the camp. Suddenly the fire flickered and nearly went out. The shadows around them seemed to grow taller, darker, shifting unnaturally. And then they saw it, out of the corner of their eyes, figures just beyond the circle of light. Dark, shapeless figures, moving silently through the trees, always just out of sight. Chris grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the darkness. "Who's messing with us?" he yelled, his voice cracking. But the beam revealed nothing, just trees and shadows. The footsteps continued, now louder, closer. It was as if something or someone was pacing right next to them, but still invisible. Julia screamed as the wind picked up, swirling the leaves violently inside the circle. Their tent, which had been outside the ring, was suddenly pulled inward, dragged violently toward the center of the tramping ground by some unseen force. The tent flaps whipped open, and for a moment, it looked as though something was moving inside. Something dark, crouching, waiting. No, this isn't happening," Danielle stammered, backing away from the circle. But her voice was drowned out by the sudden, chilling sound of laughter, a deep, guttural laugh that echoed through the trees surrounding them. It was a sound that didn't belong to any living thing. Matt was the first to break. "We have to go," he shouted, grabbing his backpack and bolting for the car. The others followed, scrambling through the underbrush in a blind panic. The footsteps followed them, growing faster, louder, until it felt as though whatever had been pacing the circle was now chasing them. They ran, gasping for breath, hearts pounding, until they burst out of the forest and into the open field where they had parked. They didn't stop until they were inside the car, doors locked, staring wide-eyed at the path they had just fled. The forest loomed behind them, dark and silent once more. But as they sat there trying to catch their breath, they saw it, just beyond the tree line, a single shadowy figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching them. And then, without a sound, it vanished. The next morning, they returned to retrieve their belongings, but the campsite was unrecognizable. Their tent, which had been pulled into the circle, was shredded to pieces. Their supplies were scattered, as though thrown by something far stronger than any of them. But the most unsettling thing was the footprints. In the soft dirt around the circle were deep, hoof-like prints, as if something with cloven feet had been pacing around their camp all night. None of them ever spoke of the Devil's Tramping Ground again. But they would never forget the sound of those footsteps in the dark, or the feeling of cold, malevolent eyes watching them from the shadows. The nightmares followed them for weeks. Dreams of a dark figure standing at the foot of their beds, its hollow eyes burning with an unnatural light, its laughter echoing in their ears. To this day, the Devil's Tramping Ground remains a place of dread, where no plants grow and no one dares to linger after dark. It's said that anyone who stays in the circle overnight will be haunted by the devil himself, tormented by nightmares so real they can drive a person mad. And though many have tried to solve the mystery of the barren ring, no one has ever found an answer. Perhaps some things are not meant to be understood. For those who dare to test the legend, the warning is simple. Once the devil starts his dance, there's no escape.